the book of the 12, it's emotionally and chronologically all over the place. It's not in any sort of order. It doesn't make logical sense starting at the beginning, going to the end. There's praise and blame where hate and hope should be. It's very confusing. You need a map. Otherwise, you get lost in the quagmire that is the minor prophets. There are wars and more wars you have to get straightened out. There are good kings and bad kings, threats of punishment. There's forgiveness and there's evil inner thoughts. There's oracles against nations, retribution, political allegiances, political turmoil, environmental degradation, human trafficking, human depravity, unadulterated loathing. Yet, in the midst of all of that, there's a crimson thread that somehow connects it all to hope and restoration. So like I said, the book of the 12 is a quagmire. It is a lot. And today we land right back in the middle of it all yet again with Habakkuk. Now you may have heard it pronounced Habakkuk or Habakkuk. I'm from the deep south. I was taught Habakkuk. Say it however you want. Whoever you're talking to about it has never read it. We know very little about Habakkuk other than he's fearful of the Chaldeans, which is another name of the Babylonians or the Neo-Babylonians. If you read Habakkuk 1, 6, and 7, we get this. For I am rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings, dwellings not their own. Dread and fearsome are they. This must date Habakkuk somewhere in the late 6th century, around the time where the Babylonians were coming in to seize Jerusalem and to send the Judeans into exile. So, to whom is Habakkuk speaking? That's a big question. This answer matters because it's the most unique out of all the other minor prophets. Habakkuk's audience is God. This book is a prayer. Its most prophetic writings are to a group of people or to an unknown audience about another group of people. But Habakkuk, he is lamenting and crying and spewing and fiercely yelling and attacking God. And in the book, God answers back. It's a short book, 3 chapters, but profoundly important to our theology because it gives us permission. It even gives us a rubric for how we can speak to God when we're angry. So follow me for a second. You may have had people in your life, like I have, who have said sentences to you like this: you can't question God. As helpful as those people are trying to be, they're wrong. The Bible actually preaches the opposite. You can question God all you want. You can wail and moan and yell and cuss and raise your fists at the sky and demand answers from God. It doesn't mean God's going to answer you, but you're allowed to do it any way that you want to. And you need to remember God is big enough to take it. I mean, Judah has lived in the promised land up until now. As far as they're concerned, they're still God's chosen. They're heavily favored among all these other armies. Yet here they are, about to be crushed by an evil they didn't know was coming. Habakkuk feels the weight of all of this brokenness. So he opens his book screaming to God. Chapter 1, verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not listen? I cry violence to you, and you don't save. Why do you make me see wrongdoing? Why do you make me see trouble? Destruction and violence are in front of me. Strife and contention arise. The law becomes slack. Any idea of justice never prevails. The wicked constantly surrounds the righteous. So your judgment, it comes forth, but it's perverted. Verse 2 is the most gut-wrenching. How long shall I cry for help, and you don't listen? Here's the deal. We touched on this last week. To be human is to suffer. It's part of the deal. And when we feel the weight of our own suffering, I'm sure we have wanted to, if not have attempted, to say something just like Habakkuk. I cry to you, and you do nothing. There's a sports story that I have not been able to get out of my head over the last several weeks. I don't know if you heard, but the Vanderbilt Commodores won their second college World Series just a few weeks ago, the beginning of the summer, which is an interesting thing to call it, a World Series, when you're only playing against other American schools. Only in America would you think you've won the World Series and you've only competed against one nation. But I digress. There's a pitcher on the team. His name's Tyler Brown. Throughout the year, we've learned a little more of his story, and then during the World Series, they did a full documentary on the backstory of his life. Tyler's mom died in his arms when he was 8 years old. He bounced around from family to family's house all the way through high school. Dad was never in the picture. No other siblings other than 2 half-sisters that went to live with other sets of family. He lived a terribly lonely childhood, a very difficult, fueled by a lot of pain and a lot of rage, losing everything that was close to him. So he did what was natural for a young boy to do. If someone tried to get close, he would push them further away. He lived a terribly hard, difficult life, and he was in trouble constantly. But he could play baseball until he blew out his elbow his senior year in high school, sidelining his chances to play college sports for several years. Vandy had recruited him hard his junior and senior year, and they still wanted him to come. I mean, Tim Corbin is on record of saying that we'll use our best doctors here to help. We'll take an 80% Brown over a 0% Brown. We want this player at Vandy. A few weeks before he showed up at school, he had to call the head coach, Tim Corbin. And he told them that I can't make it to Vandy. I'm not going to be able to accept my scholarship. I can't come. So Corbin thought for sure this was about his elbow, and he reassured him, listen, we have the best doctors. We have an entire hospital just waiting. We can help you recover, and in a couple years, you'll be back on the field. And Tyler Brown said, no, you don't understand. My high school girlfriend is expecting a child. We're going to have a baby. Tim Corbin didn't let that stop him. He said, I tell you what, Tyler, you bring your girlfriend, you also bring your baby, and we'll make it work here in Nashville. Tyler and his girlfriend moved to Nashville, delivered a beautiful baby girl who was also born with Down syndrome, creating beautiful additional challenges for the family. Tyler is juggling one of the most academically rigorous schools in the Southeast, playing on one of the best sports teams in the nation. He is now newlywed, newly fathered. He has no mother, no family. He was orphaned at 8 years old, dealing with the emotional and mental stresses that go with being a young adult. And I think about this young man's story. It reminds me of what we keep saying week after week. Life is hard. It throws us curveballs after curveballs, tripping us up, forcing us down. And if there was anyone who deserved to cry out to God, how long shall I cry for help and you don't listen? It should be Tyler Brown. This was also true for Judah, who their entire life was hanging in the balance with Babylon bearing down their army on them. Now, I'm not trying to say that Tyler Brown's story is equivalent to Habakkuk's. But what I am saying that both of their narratives reinforce what we know to be true. Life is hard. Everyone that you meet every single day of your life is fighting something that you can't see. It could be addictions, losses in jobs, frustrations with family, breakups and brokenness, financial hardships that leave you emotionally or mentally fragile, wars and PTSD, cancer, death of loved ones. We all are carrying things that the other people can't see. And most of us just grin and bear it. This was the case for Habakkuk. So he opened up his heart and he told God how he felt about it. And I think we're allowed to do that too. It is completely okay and biblical to cry out to God. It's called lament. When you're hurting, when you're dying, when you feel the weight of suffering, let God know about it. God can take it. Israel does this in the entire book of Psalms. Job does this. The book of Lamentations does this. And so does Habakkuk. And what Habakkuk does is offers us a model for how we can engage God in our suffering too. So here's how Habakkuk does it. First, he just wails. He cries. He sheds tears and addresses his hurt before God. The second thing he does is he names his complaint. He lets God know, not only am I sad, but I'm angry. I'm in pain. I have heartache and sadness over all of these reasons. When Habakkuk does this, it becomes wildly cathartic for him. In a mystical way, when he does this, just like Habakkuk, God hears us when we do this. When we first cry and then complain, God hears us and engages us. Which brings up a very important point. I need to say this exactly right. Habakkuk is not heard by God because he finally took his pain to God and addressed all the wrongdoings before God. Hear that clearly. God did not awaken to Habakkuk's plight because Habakkuk suffered and then took his suffering to God. Sometimes we think that, but that's not the case. God always hears your prayers, whether you realize it or not. What's happening here is what also happens to us. It's in our suffering that we finally open ourselves up to receiving God's presence. At least I hope when you're suffering, you're letting God participate in that suffering. Some of us want to blame God for our misfortunes, but the God of love never rains down suffering. Instead, the God of love meets you in your suffering and then comforts you through it. Habakkuk 1 is a dialogue with God. It's back and forth between the two of them, and it's worth reading. Because when you read through it, you realize how possible it is for Habakkuk to arrive at the emotional state that he's in starting in chapter 2. He opens like this. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. Habakkuk is a man who is broken to the core, and yet he finds the resolve to say, I will stand at my watchpost. This is no small change in attitude. Even in Habakkuk's distress and pain, his faith in God tells him that he will hear from God soon. And then sure enough, he does. Look at verse 2 in chapter 2. Then the Lord answered me. Write this vision, Habakkuk. Make it plain on the tablets so that the runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it does not lie. If it seems to tarry, just wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. This is the third step we're seeing in the cycle of lament. The third thing that Habakkuk does after crying and complaining is he affirms his trust that God will show up. It's the prayer of, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Lord, I believe, and I'll wait as long as I need to. Lord, I believe, because my faith knows that you're with me in all of this. This third step of lament is by far the hardest and the most crucial. Because Habakkuk does this, we get an incredible verse, Habakkuk 2:4. This verse matters for New Testament theology and the way that we even operate ourselves in 2019 as Protestants and Baptists. It is the cornerstone verse for Paul's theology on justification by faith. Habakkuk 2:4. Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous, they live by their faith. I love that line. The righteous live by their faith. This is still true for us too. Our faith tells us that God meets us in our suffering. I mean, that is pretty much the summary of Jesus' whole storyline. Jesus steps into the world's suffering and suffers our suffering unto himself. And this is what lament reminds us of. When we lament, we open ourselves to God's presence. Our minds lock in to God's presence and grace. Our soul begins to feel the depth of faith, and we are comforted when we take our lament to God, because God meets us in our suffering. And when we do this, we take on the fourth and final step of lament, assurance. Look at what Habakkuk does at the beginning of chapter 3, verse 2. O Lord, I have heard of your renown, and I stand in awe. O Lord, of your work in our own time, revive it. In our own time, make it known. In wrath, may you remember mercy. It's a beautiful line. In your own time, God, I know you will revive all of this. I am assured that in your own way, the earth will be filled with your praise. To me, this is what faith looks like in its entirety. In a nutshell, Habakkuk 3 demonstrates for us what all of us are trying to obtain. No perfect person needs faith. Faith is standing in awe in the face of mystery, even when we're suffering. Habakkuk should, of all people, be fed up with waiting on God, another day to endure, but he's not, because lament helps him move past his anger. Because he laments his frustration and complaints, he arrives at the assurance of a firmer foundation. And what we see moving from chapter 1, 2, and 3 is this cycle of lament. First he complains, and then he finds the resolve to stand on a watchtower and wait upon the Lord. And then beginning in chapter 3, he is fully on board with God's plan, and he can endure suffering. Habakkuk shows us a wonderful process for what grief can do and how we can use our grief to draw closer to God. After Vanderbilt won the College World Series, Tyler Brown had pitched crucial innings, and he did great. He is an amazing athlete and a stud on the mound. In a post-game interview, the reporter asked him, he's right there after winning the College World Series. He's on the field, and the reporter says, "Were you nervous?" It didn't appear you were, but these were huge innings that you pitched for your team. They're the biggest innings of your life. What was the pressure like? Tell us. So she sticks the microphone in this 20-year-old boy's face, and his response is what captured me. He said, "Pressure? Listen, I've experienced pressure. Pitching a few innings of baseball is not pressure. That was fun." If you're a sports person, which I know some of you aren't, but if you are, this would give you pause. Those moments for an athlete, they're what you dream of. Yeah, they're fun, but they're the epitome of pressure. The entire season is on the line, coming down to a single action that you have to perform. All of those hours of work, all of those people hoping and watching. You could either crush their dreams or excite an entire community. Even his own future depends on a matter of seconds and how well he performs. Of course, it is full of pressure. But yet Tyler Brown stands fearless in front of the camera. It just gave me pause. How? Well, it's probably because he's extremely cocky. He is a college baseball player after all. But I think the deeper reason might be because life has showed him the importance of lament. Lament helps us move past our anger. We work through our suffering, and we find hidden within it authentic faith. And we realize God meets us in our suffering. God doesn't cause it. God is not forcing us to go through it. Life is. And God chooses to join us in it. And by faith, we're given the ability to persevere. This is powerful, and it's something I think we still can do and need to remember today, that God is able to bear the pain that we feel when we learn the power of lament.